Good evening, everyone, and welcome for the Contract Essentials for Freelancers. This is actually just session 1 out of 2. So today we're handling the theory part from contracts, compliancy, and negotiations. And next week, the 15th of October, we have actually a second session to go more into detail and to answer all your questions. So do please send all your contract-related questions into the chat. And at the end of the session, we will also give some more information about next week and how to contact us and to provide your contractual issues. Let's start. So Charipickers is actually, that's our company we work for. It's an external hiring expert. So what we do is we create sustainable external hiring strategies for our clients. That includes the following domains: sourcing strategy, contract management, vendor management, on and offboarding, and invoicing. Besides that, we also help companies to connect with freelancers more directly and also build strong relationships with them. And of course, also build fair, transparent, and balanced contracts. That's also the reason why we are here today, actually, to empower you as a freelancer to negotiate more balanced contracts with your clients and partners. So my name is Swart. I'm co-founder of Charipickers, also a contingent workforce management specialist. And if I'm not working, then you can find me on the football pitch, because I'm a football coach for youth players since more than 10 years now. I'm very glad I'm not here alone today, so I brought my colleague Eszter.
Hi everyone, I'm Eszter Mészáros. I am a contract and process specialist at Charipickers since last year, December. And I am really passionate about our company because it provides a new view on the market, and it tries to create a balance that is currently a bit of a problem on the market in our point of view. So we are also here to help you and to give you more insights into how you can have better contractual relationships. So to begin with, as I mentioned, we will talk about better contractual relationships. What does that mean? We want to provide you kind of a tool that will enable you to go through a contract, see which kind of aspects are important and what you have to pay attention to. So what we will talk about today are the basics: notice period and early termination, liability, confidentiality, intellectual property, force majeure, compliancy, and we will also include some miscellaneous items at the end, and we will talk a bit about the preparation for the next session. So let's jump right into it. To begin our story, why do you actually need a contract? This is an important question because at the end of the day, you might not be so inclined to go for a contract. It, of course, will take a longer time for you to start up your assignment because you will, of course, have to take care of the negotiation process and that both parties are happy with the contract. But there are quite some pros that you have to consider, which, in our opinion, highly outweigh the cons, because you will come to a clear agreement between both parties, with you and your client. You will have clearly set rights and obligations, also your client, and this will leave little to no room for disputes in the future. So, just to give you some information, and then to put it out there, UNISO has published some of the facts about freelancers, and 49% of them actually always use contracts, and only 12% of them never use contracts. So maybe this is something to consider next time that you would either go or not go for a contract. So let's begin with the basics. What do we think is essential when you have a contract? Basic information such as company details. This can be, for example, your VAT number, your company name, your address. Then, secondly, the description of your assignment. Why is this important? You want to have a clear set of rules, let's say. What are you responsible for? You don't want to be held accounted for something that you didn't sign up for, right? So you would want your contract to include the description of the assignment. Then secondly, well, thirdly, actually, going faster in my in reality than in my head. So thirdly, you want to include your rate and your fee. You want to set at the beginning how much you will earn. Will it be a daily fee, a monthly fee? And you also want to make sure that your invoicing procedure and payment terms are indicated, because you want to know when you can invoice and when you will be paid, of course, is very important. And lastly, the duration of your assignment. What is your end date? When will you finish up your contract? So I think that kind of concludes the basic information. So I will give the word to Ian.
Indeed, well, that were the basics. So let's move on to more some important parts of contracts. Unfortunately, when you're on a project or providing services for a customer, you could be held liable for some things. First of all, maybe you damaged something on site at the customer, maybe accidentally hurt someone. Maybe losing data of the customer, or even making a professional error. We're all humans, so errors happen. In worst case scenario, you could be held liable for that, and you could receive a lot of financial claims from your customer. If those claims are really high, the damage is really high, and worst case scenario, you could go bankrupt. So let's talk about how avoiding to go bankrupt. First of all, it's quite important to have the right insurances. In these scenarios, you have two types of insurances. The first one is the insurance for professional liability. That's for the examples we mentioned, professional errors and loss of data. Secondly, you'll also have an insurance for civil liability. That's more for the damage, the material damage on site, or the accidentally hurting people. I know it's an investment, but let's be honest, it's a small investment. In Belgium, it's like around, for both of them together, it's like 500 to 600 euros for both insurances. But then with that small investment, you can sleep well at night if there happens something on your project. So really take this tip and get a right insurance for your projects. It's quite easy for people and customers to blame other people that they're in breach or have a failure. So make sure that you have written down in your contract that when they are actually claiming something towards you, that the failure or breach should be proven. They really have to prove that the problem was situated at your site. Then, when handling a project or performing services, the contract could be based on an obligation of conduct or on an obligation of result. The difference is quite big. When handling a project with an obligation of conduct, then you're actually just saying to a customer, I will use my best endeavors for achieving the agreed result. That's quite safe, because you're just saying, yeah, I will do my best to reach that result. If it doesn't happen, okay, no worries. But the obligation of result, that's quite dangerous. Why? No matter what, you're actually responsible for achieving the result, the agreed result with your customer. So you're also depending on external circumstances, information that you need to get from the clients, or maybe their goodwill. So next time you enter into a contract or a project, make sure that you try to negotiate an obligation of conduct. Then you're quite safe on the liability side. Last but not least, for the liability, as said before, financial claims can be high, can be really dangerous to go into bankruptcy. So make sure that you agree and negotiate a maximum liability amount with your customer. Best way to do that is actually to take a look at your insurance policy. For which amounts am I insured for which case, in which circumstance, and agree on those amounts in your contract. Then you can sleep well at night. If there is something happening on the project, it can happen, as said before, we're all humans, but let's protect ourselves. I'm quite sure if you really follow these tips and tricks in your next contract negotiations, then you can proceed your professional career in the most safe way. That was the part liability from the contract, Esther. Let's see what's next on the agenda. Also a liability, confidentiality, Esther.
Definitely. Let's talk a bit about confidentiality, which is really a hot topic, of course, in the professional world, because I mean, it's pretty challenging today to keep data confidential. So this is why we also have in our contract a clause which defines confidentiality, and also the kind of the surrounding information contractually. So I will go a bit more in detail about this. So on the right side, you see the actual article from our contract, and I will just run through the different paragraphs very quickly, so you have an idea of what we include in such a clause. So first of all, what is confidential information and what is not confidential information? What can you expose and what not? And then further, if it's needed to expose this information, then what are the conditions for us? For example, you have to keep the other party informed. It's important to mention here that when you read these articles, for us, it goes both ways. And it's important that you pay attention that these clauses, they are not one-sided. It's not the point that your client is protected from everything and you're not. So just as you have to keep information confidential, they also have to keep your information confidential. So to go further with the articles, for example, we also included here who you can share this information with, for example, other people working on the same project from your company, and what happens if your contract ends. In our case, for example, confidentiality will continue even if the contract comes to an end. Then finally, we also define what happens in case of a breach. So Ian talked also about penalties, and in cases of liability, for example, this is a good example. What happens when you include a penalty in a clause? For example, the limit here is 15,000 per breach.
Okay. So, to be quite transparent to everyone, this PowerPoint will be shared with everyone. So who's interested in the whole article, we're glad to share it, and you can use it. So you're allowed to use it if you want. It will be shared after our presentation today. Thank you, Esther. Intellectual property, that's something actually we're actually using more than we think on a daily basis. We have the definition on the screen, but I just will move on with the most important part for us as freelancers. When you're on a project, it could be the case that you're actually creating software, creating data, making designs or creations, and that's actually intellectual property. It's something you create from scratch. For example, if you're an architect and you're making building plans for a customer, that's intellectual property you create for a customer. What's actually the thing with intellectual property is the ownership. At the moment you create the intellectual property for a customer, who has the rights on the IP? Does it stay at your side, or are you transferring your IP rights to the client? It's an important question to ask for different reasons. First of all, if you're keeping the IP rights, so then actually your rate will be lower than when you will transfer your IP to the client. Why? If you transfer your IP to the client, they can use it over and over again. Yeah. If it stays at your side, they will have to pay you again and again actually to use your IP. So make sure that you make clear agreement in the contract. First, what is the IP that you are creating? That's really defined what IP you're creating for the customer. And secondly, define who is the owner of the IP and when it would be transferred in which cases. Lastly, on IP rights, something we might forget when working for a customer. It could also be the case that you will be receiving, for example, software from their side to design a program. You don't know for sure that software they are providing that there's no infringement with the IP. So you could be liable for actually the infringement claim. So make sure that there is mentioned in your contract that if you're using actually the IP provided by the customer, that you're not liable for infringements. So far for IP, I think that was a quick one, but important. Let's move to the force majeure, Eszter.
Yes. So force majeure, you might be familiar with this concept. So you might be not, because it's not always in contracts. But to us, this seems relevant because when something big happens, something bad happens that you did not foresee, then you want to be covered in those cases as well. So what is force majeure to begin with? It's an unforeseeable external circumstance that prevents someone from fulfilling a contract. So something big happened, you did not expect it, and you cannot fulfill your services. So again, what we brought to you is on the right side, the contractual conditions that we have. I will again quickly go through it. First of all, we define when you have to notify the client. And again, this should go both ways. So both from you towards the client and from the client towards you. Then we go through to who is liable and when force majeure is applicable. And then in the third paragraph, we say, for example, if there is a third party involved, let's say you have a supplier who cannot supply you the services that you need in order to do your services at your client, what happens then? Who is liable? And then lastly, we mention what is the period that this force majeure can go on, and when both parties have the right to end the contract without notice period. So let's talk about a few examples. So a good one and a relevant one right now is the Corona lockdown. So pay attention here. This is not about the whole crisis that we are going through at the moment. This is specifically about the lockdown. This is specifically about cases when you could not provide services. You were unable to do it. For example, you had to go to your client, but it was prohibited to go outside. You were not able to get there. You could not provide services. Another good example are the terrorist attacks, for example, in Brussels, which was completely unforeseeable. Whole Brussels was in lockdown. No one could go in and out. So there were some services that could not be provided. Then it can be a technical failure, storm, something that really stops you from working. There is no way out. So I think this kind of closes the close about force majeure.
Yeah, indeed. But before moving on, because I forgot something with the confidentiality clause, again, we're happy to share this clause with all you guys. So also you can use this one. But the thing I forgot to mention, and we're talking about liabilities today, we will not be liable if you misuse our articles. Just saying. Just to be safe, it's on tape, so we're not liable for misuse of our articles. Okay, so compliancy, that's the thing I wanted to do right now, to be compliant. But let's get back to the topic of today. So compliancy. There are some things you need to take in account when working as an independent, as a freelancer. When you work a long time for one customer for several years, it could be that actually a social inspection would actually consider you as a fake independent. What does it mean? That they will not consider you actually as an actual freelancer, but that you are actually working as an employee of your customer. How do you prevent that? First of all, it needs to be fully clear in the contract that it's the will of both parties to organize the work independently, so with a freelancer and not on an employee basis. Next to that, you're a freelancer, so you want to be free, and that's also one of the from the factors here. You need to have the right to organize your work time independently without any consent of the customer. And last of all, there may not be any hierarchical control from the client towards you as a freelancer. What could happen if you're not following these rules and you would really be seen as a fake independent? That could be actually, the case could be that you will be struck out as a freelancer, and from day one from today 2, you will be actually on the payroll of your customer. I know it's an extreme example, but this is what can happen if you're considered as a fake independent. So make sure that you write all these things also clearly in a contract. Why? The social inspection, when they really have maybe an ID that you would be fake independent, first thing they will do is check your contract and the agreements that you made for your project. Moving on to instruction rights, it's a little bit a similar topic. A client is only allowed to give you certain instructions on your project. The instructions they can give are only the strict necessary for the proper execution of the assignment. For example, welfare, health, and security guidelines. I'll give you one example. If you are a painter, your client can instruct you which door you have to paint, but they cannot instruct you how to paint the door, because you're an independent professional. You have the expertise. They hired your external expertise to do the job. So they can show you where you have to paint, but not how you have to paint. Take that into account. Yeah, some years ago, we all know that the legislation about personal data and privacy has changed in Europe. It's called the GDPR legislation. Now, what does it mean for us as freelancers? It's not applicable for everyone, I guess, but at the moment that you're performing services for a customer and you're actually processing personal data at customer side, you should actually make a data processing agreement. What is a data processing agreement? It's actually an agreement stating which personal data of the client you will be processing and how you will process that. So make sure if you come into contact with personal data and the processing of personal data, that you drop a separate data processing agreement next to your framework agreement or contract. I also heard that there would be a lot of European freelancers today, so that's why we put the Limosa legislation also in our presentation today. Let's start with what is Limosa. It's quite similar to Dimona for employees in Belgium. So now, what is Dimona then for employees? It's actually the registration of an employee that he's working for, actually for his employer. It registers the taxes of that employee. So it's mandatory for European freelancers coming to Belgium when they work here to register for a Limosa. There's one big exception. If you have a Belgian VAT number, then you're not obliged to take Limosa. On the Limosa website, you see the link on the screen. You can get all the information in which circumstances you're mandatory to take the Limosa and when not. So why is the Limosa important? As a European freelancer, you're of course paying taxes in your own country, but at the moment that you come to Belgium and perform services in Belgium for a Belgian customer, you also have you have to pay taxes in Belgium as well. And that's what the Limosa does. That separates your taxes in your own country and in Belgium. And now we're talking about taxes, and I will also include the social charges. Something, not a lot of freelancers know, but also not a lot of big corporates know. That is when you're working with a client or with a partner, when you have a commercial relationship, you could be held liable for their outstanding payments regarding social charges and taxes. So next time you enter into contract with a client or with another partner, if they're not paying their taxes or they're late, it could be the case that the government will knock on your door actually to retrieve the money from your side. How can you prevent this in Belgium? By 2 attestations, the 276C2 attestation for taxes and the C45 attestation for social charges. You can request them at your commercial partner or a client, and they can retrieve them from the government. It's really an attestation stating that they have no outstanding debts regarding aforementioned topics. So if you want to be sure that you are not paying for other ones' taxes and social charges, then get into the attestations as mentioned. I think we're a little bit more compliant now that we have tackled these topics. So maybe another topic of contracts is the end of contracts.
Yes, so let's talk about some options when your contract comes to an end. So in a very, very ideal situation, you have a set end date in your contract, and this end date comes, you stop your project. It's clear for everyone that from now on you're not working with your client. But in some cases, it can happen that either you or the client would like to stop the cooperation. This can be for several reasons. Let's say you found a new project and you would like to end the current one so that you can work on the other one. In these cases, you have to take the notice period into account. For those who are not quite familiar with the concept, but I think most of you are, the notice period is the time between giving your notice, so saying you want to leave, and the actual date when you finish your contract. We call this termination for convenience because either you or the client decided you want to end the cooperation for whatever reason, and there was no huge event that would lead to an immediate termination, which we will go into in a minute. So the period of the notice period, actually, the length of it depends on the length of your contract. Very often, we advise that you would take 1 month as a notice period because this gives you enough time to look for another assignment if your client ends the contract, and it gives the client also enough time to look for someone new if you end it. So in the last cases, that's of course the least ideal one. There is an early termination, and this can have several reasons. We listed some of them here. For example, one of you, either you or the client, is convicted of a criminal offense, which is of course very serious. One of you have declared bankruptcy. There was professional misconduct or negligence, or there was a serious breach in obligations. It's also very relevant that you keep in mind to make this also both ways, because it's something that clients often try to do, kind of go from one way towards you, that if either you fall in one of these situations that I just listed, but don't forget that your client can also do these things. So keep in mind that it has to go both ways. So as last point, it's also, you have to keep in mind your payments. So what happens when your contract is ended prematurely? You either have your payment because you worked until that moment, or your client said in the contract that you will not be paid for the prestations that you did until that day. So this is, of course, a problem because you want to get paid for the work that you have done. So be careful not to include any clause in your contract which would prevent you from getting paid for the work that you have already done. And I think that's the last point that we should mention with the notice period. Can you think of anything else?
I don't think so. I think the payment is the most important part if the contract ended early.
I think so.
All right.
Okay.
But we have some other topics lined up.
Yes. These are smaller topics, but we wanted to mention it to you because these are often in contracts, or they should be in contracts, in our opinion. So first of all, non-competition clause. This is a clause that would specify if the conditions under which you can work for the end customer. So this is the customer of your client. So let's say that you're using a supplier and they put you at a project. Then of course it's not in the interest of your supplier to let you work directly to the end customer. This is also kind of logical. They want to protect their business, but you can, for example, ask them to limit the time so that, for example, it would be 1 year that you have to wait until you can actually work for the end customer after ending the contract with the supplier. Then, in case,
okay. Can I add one for the non-competition? Yeah, because we're talking with freelancers today. So maybe some of you guys also have projects with customers and also use other freelancers, partners actually to perform services for your customer. Then a non-competition clause could be interesting for you because actually, yeah, you're actually opening the door for them at your customer. So if there's not a non-competition clause in your contract, yeah, they can try to sneak away your customer. So that's also the other way around that you can make use in a proper way of the non-competition.
Yeah, yeah. comment.
I know.
So, in the second topic, conflict resolution, what we wanted to mention here is, it can always happen. There is a conflict between you and the client, something happened, and you want to make sure that in your contract it's specified what the procedure is if there is a conflict. So you would, for example, want to include a clause that specifies that in the first step, you have to try to come to terms with your client directly. If that doesn't work out, you can go through legal counsels, and only at the last step, if the legal counsels cannot come to terms, you go to the court, which is of course costing everyone a lot of money. So you would want to avoid this. So this can kind of help you to mitigate if there is a conflict. Then the third point, illness and long-term absence. This is something that you would want to cover because it's something unexpected. You wouldn't think to break your leg tomorrow, but it can happen. And in those cases, you would want to be covered for what happens between you and the client. So you can, for example, include a clause. I think last time in the session there was a question about this. So we thought we could give this as an example. You could include a clause where, for example, you specify that you have the right to substitute yourself with another freelancer with the same kind of qualifications in case of illness or long-term absence.
Yeah, it's a better way than lose a project.
Yeah,
Indeed.
Exactly. So if the client can agree to it, it can also be in their interest because they don't lose the workforce immediately on the project. And then the fourth topic is vague terminology. This is something when you read a contract and you really immediately don't feel comfortable with it because you don't know what is actually written in it. It can be interpreted in so many ways. Maybe someone else will read it and you would have a lot of problems with it. It might happen. So you would want to avoid that. You want clear, concise language. And a good example of this is, for example, reasonable. So if you think about the word reasonable, which comes a lot in contracts, do you know what it means? I know what it means for me. I might have an idea what it means to Ian, but
maybe for you 5 days is reasonable, but
exactly.
I don't know, maybe 5 days is reasonable for me, but not for Eszter.
So when it's exactly, so when it's written in a contract that you have a, let's say you would have a reasonable notice period, not a good idea. So make sure that the terminology used is clear for everyone, so you don't end up with problems at the end. So I think these were the main topics that we wanted to discuss today.
Correct.
So maybe we can just discuss a bit more about next session.
Indeed, correct. So because as stated in the beginning of the session, this was just the first out of 2. So what we try to do today is indeed give a more theoretical version of contracts, compliancy, and contractual issues. I'm sure that there will be some questions in the chat already, or maybe some things you're thinking about at the moment. Or I had a problem in the past, or maybe you have a practical situation for the future that you're thinking about. So what we will do is actually all questions that are in the chat, maybe also already answered, but there's a little bit of discussion. I don't know because I don't see the chat. We will use them and handle them next week. Next to that, next to the questions that are already in the chat, we also invite you to send all your questions, other questions or issues to the email address on the screen with the right subject, or actually you can also just make connection on the freelance business platform that we are using for these webinars, and there you can connect with me in person and also send your questions and issues. So really, if you want to go into practice and really discuss your contractual issues, then I really invite you to register also for the session next week, and don't forget to give us enough to talk about. So really go to the next session and register already for next week.